The following presentation contains material which may not be deemed appropriate for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Are you in the right headspace for a good, hard roll in the hay? Or do you need to work on a few of the finer points before doing the deed? Hopefully, what you're coming to realize is that to successfully enjoy casual sex, you've got to make sure that you're approaching it with an optimal attitude and perspective. That you're having it because it's what you want, and all that you want. You've got to do it for good, non-committal fun. Not because you're hoping that sleeping with a guy will make him want you more. Not because you're seeking a quick cure for painfully low self-esteem. And not because you're looking for Mr. Right.
From Joy Alexa Sherman and Nicole Tonkinton's book, The Happy Hookup, A Single Girl's Guide to Casual Sex.
Not everyone you have sex with will necessarily be affectionate. Deal with it. You got laid, didn't you? If you can't live without cuddles, get a dog. Sure, it needs walking and feeding, but it's way more likely to give you affection than some random guy you pulled.
From Emily Duberly's book, Sex Play.
Repeat to yourself before, during, and after sex. This is not about love, nor will it ever be. Remind yourself that all the pleasure and happiness you're feeling is a chemical response. You're not special to the person who you're shagging, and he is not special to you. The two of you do not have some huge personal connection. What you're doing is not related to happily ever after. It may not even last a full 3 days. But hopefully it will last longer than 3 minutes. It's simply about sex, purely a physical release, and there's no real future in it. But there is a present.
From 6 Tips How to Have Casual Sex, marieclaire.com.
Even if it wasn't the greatest sex ever, still we both got laid. To quote the notable film Threesome, to me, sex is like pizza. Even if it's bad, it's still pretty good.
From Etiquette Guide for Casual Sex, aol.co.nz.
And finally, it's back home for the grand finale. Have at least one new sex toy ready and waiting. And when the action starts, remember, variety is the key. There are over 600 possible sexual positions, but almost all of us tend to choose between 2 or 3. Don't let yourself stick with these tonight. I suggest a rule: 30 thrusts in each position. Then add another, and another, and another, and another, and another.
From Glamour, a British magazine for women, quoted by Rosalind Gill in her article, Mediated Intimacy and Post-Feminism, a Discourse Analytic Examination of Sex and Relationships Advice in a Woman's Magazine, published in a special issue of Discourse and Communication, edited by Michelle Lazar.
Men love it when you ask their advice or opinion. To make a man fall in love with you, you need to make him feel like you're very similar people.
Tracy Cox, author of the book Super Flirt.
Now, like I have this thing where I won't sleep with guys on the first date because I just don't like the feeling of being used the next day. And for me, that's a really big thing. And so, but this guy, we were hooked up one night and then I wouldn't sleep with him. So the next night, he ended up spending the night and I slept with him. And then he never talked to me again. And so now, like even that little theory of mine, it's like totally blown out the window.
from a paper by Melanie A. Barris and Pantea Farvid of the University of Auckland, published in the journal Sexualities.
I love lavender. I mean, I'm crazy about it. I have a ritual I do. When I bring a guy home for some action, I always light a bunch of candles and spray my bed with lavender, pillow, and room spray. The response I get is truly amazing. Men really love it. Almost all have commented on the fragrance and said my bed and room are so comfortable and they love the way it smells. I don't know if it's helped turn them on, but I do know nobody has complained yet.
From The Happy Hookup, A Single Girl's Guide to Casual Sex, by Alexa Joy Sherman and Nicole Tokentin.
A booty call should be ended at the first sign of any feelings, either yours or theirs. This is to avoid any serious drama or being ensnared unexpectedly in the trap of a relationship. Maybe you noticed you've been thinking about your booty call more than usual. No good. But the big flashing neon sign that you should abort the booty is when they ask you where the relationship is headed. That's your sign to head for the hills.
From When Good Booty Calls Go Bad, Fantasy.com.
Let me set the scene for you. It's Friday night and you're out on the town. You're catching up with friends, and after a couple of drinks, you feel suitably relaxed. You look across the bar and spot a handsome specimen. You buy a drink and strike up a conversation. On closer inspection, your target is still hot stuff. But once they reveal they work in IT, have a pet ferret, or a passion for Delta Goodrum, you realize they're just not relationship material. Instead of walking away and letting the physical attraction go to waste, why not enjoy their company without the expectation of it leading to something more? And this is just one likely scenario when casual sex would be the best option for all involved.
From What's Wrong with Casual Sex, Yahoo.com.
Just like all of the other species in the animal kingdom, we have needs. Sometimes these needs are of a sexual nature. Why not satisfy your urges with a little no-strings-attached loving?
From What's Wrong with Casual Sex, Yahoo.com.
Since ships only stop at my port once, I haven't exactly had time to figure out what being good in bed would be like, let alone determine whether I am or not. And then a vicious circle starts. A ship visits my port, and I don't know whether my port was adequately hospitable or not. The ship never comes again, but easily finds a new port, and I assume that my port was not good enough. Except I don't actually know whether my port was good or bad or in between, because I don't have time to adjust to each new ship.
Internet commentary paraphrased by Rebecca Plant from her article, Hooking It Up, Sex in the Bedroom, included in her book, Sexualities in Context, A Social Perspective, published by Routledge. In a chapter entitled Unweaving the Rainbow of Human Sexuality, a review of one-night stands, serious romantic relationships, and the relationship space in between, contained in the book The Psychology of Love and Hate in Intimate Relationships, edited by Catherine Omer, Peter K. Jonasson, and Rhonda N. Balzani of the University of Western Australia state, generally speaking, sex research has been plagued with implicit biases against the very act of sex itself. For instance, a content analysis of articles appearing in 4 prestigious journals, namely the Journal of Sex Research, Archives of Sexual Behavior, the New England Journal of Medicine, and Obstetrics and Gynecology from 1960 to the present revealed that only a slim minority of articles, 7%, investigated positive aspects of love, sex, and intimacy. The vast majority, 58% of articles, focused on the problems associated with such behavior or could not be classified, 35%. These biases are even stronger in casual sex relationships, a type of relationship that is often treated as a pathology. In discussing the consequences of casual sex, the literature has focused almost exclusively on the perils of casual sex. Many articles read more like dire warnings than scholarly attempts to understand sexuality. Up until 5 years ago, anyone who read the research on relationships might conclude that individuals only engage in two forms of relationships: one-night stands on the one hand, and serious romantic relationships on the other. In recent years, however, a few pioneering social psychologists have become interested in more casual encounters. For example, one-night stands, hookups, fuck-buddy sex, friends with benefits, anonymous sex, no strings attached, booty calls, swinging, chance encounters, sports sex, cruising, and dogging. Individuals appear to engage in non-relational sex for reasons thought by those in the past to be confined to serious romantic relationships. They, in fact, were engaging in casual sex to achieve emotional intimacy. Of the various manifestations of casual sex studied by these and others, let us first turn to hooking up. In her book, Sexualities in Context, A Social Perspective, Rebecca Plant of Ithaca College wrote, "Hooking up is not dating. Going steady, as in the 1950s and 1960s usage, having a boyfriend or girlfriend, or being engaged to be married. Hooking up may be any of the following: committed, casual, regular, habitual, a fling of brief duration, emotionally intense, physically intense, sporadic, irregular, intoxicating, drunken, late night/early morning, embarrassing, or a point of pride." Synonymous terms might include being involved, in quotes, one-night stand, having/being a fuck buddy, friends with benefits/privileges, booty calls, which may involve drunk dialing, get that, it's a lot of fun, getting lucky, scoring. Potential elements of hooking up include making out, snogging, relatively unrestrained groping, various tricks with hands and tongues, nudity, oral and anal exploits, and of course, penile vaginal intercourse, perhaps even in this order. Okay? Meanwhile, researchers at James Madison University found that 77.7% of women and 84.2% of men had hooked up, a process they said routinely involves, quote, petting below the waist, oral sex, or intercourse, unquote. At the University of Michigan, more than 60% of students reported hooking up. They said that a typical hookup more often included, quote, genital touching, unquote, than a meaningful conversation. Benefits of casual sex or sports sex beyond the one-night stand include ego boost, feeling sexually desirable and desired by others, experiencing one's own desire released from constraint, emotional boost, feeling as if interest is reciprocated, being able to feel close to someone, experimentation. A FWB or fuck buddy situation could afford the opportunity to experiment sexually. A hookup may be seen as having, quote, little to lose, unquote, freeing participants to experiment. Empowerment, probably more likely to be cited or believed by women than men, accompanied by the statement that women are entitled to sexual pleasure too. The feeling of belonging. It feels good to feel similar, to feel like we fit in with the friends we have chosen if our friends are hooking up. Sex without emotions, without the risk of getting involved or of getting hurt emotionally. Pleasure. Feeling like an adult, feeling autonomous and in charge of one's life. The excitement of various risks and dangers of hookups, and finally, last but not least, fun. In an article entitled Lust, Love, Status, Young Adults' Motives for Engaging in Casual Sex, published in the Journal of Psychology and Human Sexuality, Pamela C. Regan, Ph.D. of California State University, Los Angeles, and Carla S. Dreyer of Xavier University report on their research into casual sex on college campuses. Men and women college students who had entered casual sex liaisons were asked to describe the reasons or motives that prompted their behavior in a free response essay format. As expected, men and women generated similar response. Specifically, both genders emphasized intra-individual, e.g., sexual desire, sexual experimentation, physical pleasures, alcohol use, and factors associated with a casual sex partner, e.g., attractiveness, as reasons for their short-term sexual encounters. Many researchers have asked the question, what predisposes women and men to have casual sex? In an article published in 2022 in the journal Sexuality and Culture, Inga Boot of the Amsterdam School of Communication Research and her colleagues investigated individual differences in the influence of the likability of a sexual female main character on women's willingness to have casual sex with a stranger. Specifically, they studied the moderating role of relationship status and satisfaction with one's relationship or with being single. Women, age 18 to 30, who were single or in a relationship, watched an erotic scene with a likable or unlikable sexual female main character who had had casual sex. In both experiments, women in a relationship were less willing to have casual sex than single women after they had seen a likable sexual female character. However, an unpredicted effect was found in experiment 2. After seeing an unlikable sexual female character, women who were dissatisfied with their relationship or with being single were more willing to have casual sex than their satisfied counterparts. File under Food for Thought. Another article published in 2022 asks the probing question, was it good for you? Gender differences in motives and emotional outcomes following casual sex. This paper was published in the journal Sexuality and Culture and was written by Billy E. McKean, Department of Psychology, College of Healthcare Sciences, James Cook University, Australia, Ryan C. Anderson, and David A. Mitchell. In their study of 371 participants, those that scored highly on sociosexuality, defined as a stable personality orientation to casual sex, reported lower levels of anxiety and depression and higher levels of self-esteem and life satisfaction, suggesting that casual sex can have positive emotional outcomes. This study concluded that there were no long-term negative consequences on psychological well-being following casual sex. Got that? Meanwhile, Srandzej Vanavraglova, Department of Psychology, NYU and Cornell, concluded that casual sex may increase self-esteem and substantially enhance positive psychological growth. Their study found no significant differences between men and women, supposing the argument that other factors predict emotional outcomes, rather than gender, following casual sex. Although there was an overall gender differences in the motivations for casual sex, it is noteworthy that men and women similarly endorse statements such as, I had a hookup for personal enjoyment or fun, or both. In an article published in the Journal of Sex Research, Kendra Knight of DePaul University reports that positive reactions to casual sex, satisfaction, confidence, self-knowledge, or social and academic engagement are stronger and more common than negative reactions. Sociosexually unrestricted students typically reported higher well-being after having casual sex compared to not having casual sex. There was no such difference among restricted individuals. Few gender differences were found. In an article published in 2018 in the Journal of Relationships Research, Justin R. Garcia of Indiana University Bloomington and his colleagues conducted a preliminary internet-based questionnaire investigation into the role of affectionate behaviors. Operationalized here is cuddling, spending the night in cuddling, foreplay, and eye-gazing across two sexual relationship contexts: committed, by which they meant traditional romantic relationships, and uncommitted, by which they meant casual sex encounters. While affectionate behaviors were desired more often in romantic relationships than in casual sexual encounters, many respondents, both women and men, engaged in these affectionate behaviors during casual sex encounters as well. This was especially pronounced in those who expressed a preference for casual sex encounters over romantic relationships. In a casual sex context, these participants were about 1.5 times more likely to cuddle, 1.5 times as likely to spend the night and cuddle, and 5 times more likely to engage in foreplay with a partner. This is perhaps contrary to the way in which many people think about casual sex. There is a certain mystique surrounding relationships that is not always true, just as there is a mystique around official, declared love. We here at the Explore Ecstatic Sensuality podcast view these expressions of tenderness in casual sexual encounters as expressions of love. Love in the moment. Love that is fresh, new, and vibrant. Casual sex, one-night stands, hookups, booty calls, sports sex, fuck buddy sex, and so forth are given a bad rep by those who are in the relationship business. They look down on those who wish to explore their sensuality and their love through casual sex. We regard that something which stunts the sexual growth and expression of many is harmful. Harmful. Such fascination here in the concept that foreplay may, and in fact is, more common, more typical in casual sex than it is in committed relationship sex, such as marriage. Fascinating. Back to our research. In an article published in the journal Archives of Sexual Behavior, Val Wagsbokang, Department of Psychology, University of Florida, Gainesville, Gregory D. Webster and Mary H. Burleson presented the results of their study of 401 women aged 18 to 69 who had reported having had casual sex in the past 12 months. Participants completed an online survey reporting their motives to have casual sex, sexual assertiveness, and orgasmic function, e.g., orgasm frequency, satisfaction with orgasm, in casual sex. They focused on 2 motives to have casual sex: A, the pleasure motive, and B, insecurity, i.e., self-esteem boost and pressure motive. Results showed that greater pleasure, autonomous motives, related to higher sexual assertiveness, which in turn related to higher orgasmic function in casual sex. Reminder that here we are talking about a study of women. In contrast, greater insecurity, non-autonomous motives related to lower sexual assertiveness, which in turn related to lower orgasmic function in casual sex. These findings support what is known as self-determination theory, suggesting that autonomous motives are important for women's sexual experience in casual sex. Sexual assertiveness is the ability to communicate sexual needs and initiate sexual behavior with a partner. Existing literature shows that sexual assertiveness positively correlates with orgasm, sexual satisfaction, sexual pleasure, positive feelings, and lower sexual regret after casual sex in women. Comparatively little is known about the relationship between women's motives to have casual sex and their sexual assertiveness. Being sexually assertive may be especially important in casual sex contexts, for example, one-night stands, where one cannot simply rely on partner familiarity and responsiveness. It is possible that women who differ in their reasons to have casual sex may also differ in their level of sexual assertiveness. Because women with autonomous motives have sex primarily to fulfill their sexual needs, they should not be subservient to their partner's needs, and should instead be more assertive about what they want sexually. For instance, women who are motivated by autonomous sexual goals may be more likely to communicate about their specific sexual needs during the sexual interaction that eventually leads to orgasm during casual sex. Although these researchers realized that there are many reasons for women to have casual sex, they only studied two motives, pleasure and insecurity. For the insecurity motive, women have casual sex because they want to maintain self-esteem or in response to some internal pressures, e.g., not wanting to be seen as rude or a prude. Both pleasure and insecurity motives are common in casual sex and are on opposite ends of what we're referring to as the autonomy continuum. Women who are more motivated to gain sexual pleasure reported having more orgasms in their more recent sexual encounter. Why were women with greater autonomous motives also more sexually assertive? It could be simply because women who have more autonomous motivations, e.g., have sex for enjoyment, by definition place greater importance on their own sexual pleasure and are therefore more willing and able to communicate their needs. Further, past research showed that many women were unwilling to communicate about what they wanted in bed, especially with casual partners. This is understandable because in many cases, for example one-night stands, these partners were just a stranger or someone they did not know well. However, because women who had casual sex for autonomous reasons prioritized their pleasure, they might not hesitate to assert their sexual needs with any partners. These researchers' findings indicate that having sex for autonomous reasons is positively linked to greater communication and sexual well-being in casual sex encounters. So, what is an important, perhaps the most important element in all experiences involving sex? All experiences involving sex. Communication. And by this we mean, for both women and men, to express their sexual needs and their emotional needs. This can be done both with words and through gestures, as anyone who has ever had sex knows perfectly well. In an article published in the Journal of Social Psychology, Roy F. Baumeister of Florida State University and Juan Pablo Mendoza of the Free University of Amsterdam discussed the results of an online sex survey with 317,000 participants in 37 nations. All four of the measures they studied were correlated with independent, in this case World Economic Forum, ratings of gender equality. Consistent with predictions, relatively high gender equality was associated with more casual sex, more sex partners per capita, younger ages for first sex, and greater tolerance/approval of premarital sex. These researchers state emphatically that female sexuality has social exchange value. That is the core idea in sexual economics theory. This is based on two assumptions. The first is the general, quote, principle of least interest proposed by Waller and Hill, which is that the person with the greater desire has less power and may therefore have to offer extra inducements in order to influence the other person. This has become a standard view in social exchange theory and has often been applied to analyzing unequal love relationships, just as one example. The relevant implication is that the relative strength of male sexual desire puts men at a negotiating disadvantage and creates the basis for a marketplace in which men will offer women researchers such as love, status, respect, money, and long-term commitment in exchange for sex. Does anyone out there notice that? Gee, anyone watch television? Anyone had a relationship? Anyone had friends? Anyway, we began this episode with a few samples of advice for women published in popular women's magazines as well as in online advice columns and blogs. In an article by Rosalind Gill of the City University of London, published in the journal Discourse and Communication, the author discusses how these advice columns and so forth instruct women about menology, in which women are instructed how to learn to please men, and transforming the self, which calls on women to remodel their interior lives in order to construct a desirable subjectivity. It involves intensive monitoring of one's own feelings and desires and attitudes, and those of the partner or the potential partner. Moreover, it requires that sex be positioned at the heart of a remodeled subjectivity in a way that involves both physical labor, for example, trying out new positions, taking lessons in striptease, and ongoing psychological work. Concentrating on the British women's magazine Glamour, she concludes that Glamour's advice is designed not simply to reshape behavior, but to get inside and reconstruct women's notions of what it is to be a sexual subject. That is, a subject in general. Do I have the right attitude to sex? Am I open enough? Have I eradicated shame? Do I push myself to try new things? Have I ever had sex for the wrong reasons? Is my fantasy life exciting enough? These are the questions which Glamour magazine, very popular in the United Kingdom, encourages its women readers to ask themselves. And then, of course, there is Cosmo. In studying this publication, David Machen of Xinjiang University and Joanna Thornborough of Université de Bretagne Occidentale conclude that in Cosmo, women are portrayed as sex objects. This is disguised, however, by representing women as daring and dangerous through sex. However, the sexual acts represented are only mildly transgressive and still founded on traditional sex roles. In the fantasies which Cosmo encourages and promotes, women act alone and rely on acts of seduction and social maneuvering rather than on intellect to act in and on the world. That is to say, act in and on a world which is controlled by men who are, when all is said and done, only too willing to be seduced by a Cosmo woman. Golly, have I ever been seduced by a Cosmo woman? Scary thought. I've got to think about that. In a paper by Pantea Farvid of AUT University and Virginia Brown of the University of Auckland entitled The Sassy Woman and the Performing Man, Heterosexual Casual Sex Advice, and the Reconstitution of Gendered Subjectivity, published in the journal Feminist Media Studies, the authors used a Foucauldian post-structural mode of discourse analysis to explore how casual sex advice in 3 self-help books, 2 aimed at women, 1 aimed at men, and online advice articles constituted casual sex and masculine and feminine heterosexual subjectivity. 4 main, profoundly gendered, subject positions were identified in the text, the, quote, strategic man, the performing man, the sassy woman, and the vulnerable woman. Some of the advice these authors analyzed was given at the beginning of this episode. That advice produced vastly gendered and sexed beings in relation to casual sex. Yet, for both women and men, ideal casual sex was something that did not come completely naturally. And both women and men were advised to fight against their supposed natural dispositions. Women getting emotionally involved, men seeming desperate for sex, and to approach casual sex in very specific ways. Women by being well-equipped, emotionally, physically, and psychologically. Men by being strategic and practiced. So, as heterosexual casual sex was depicted as work for both women and men, women had to work a bit harder to become casual sex ready. Golly. In another article by these same authors, this one published in the journal Feminism and Psychology, they analyze online texts concerning supposed rules and etiquette for heterosexual casual sex, exploring how ideal casual sex was constructed, as object and as practice. These researchers examined how casual sex was constituted by authors who positioned themselves as knowledgeable and or expert authorities in relation to casual sex. I myself am such an expert, and I am surprised that they did not contact me. Next time, please. At any rate, Farbett and Brown argue that casual sex was constituted as not a natural act, through the specific instructions of how to do casual sex right. The data they utilized were collected through individual web searches using a number of Google search engines: Google New Zealand, Google Australia, Google United States, and Google United Kingdom. The following phrases, all various forms of terminology for casual sex, were used as search terms in each search engine: casual sex, hookups, friends with benefits, one-night stands, booty call, and fuck buddy. The focus of these authors' analysis was on examining how self-appointed experts, or people who position themselves as knowledgeable about casual sex, constructed and relayed the rules of casual sex in a public forum. On the internet, they learned that casual sex does not come naturally. Sexual desire was deemed natural, but casual sex required guidelines, ground rules, and a code of conduct. These authorities claimed knowledge and expertise about casual sex and produced a certain, to employ Michel Foucault's terminology, regime of truth about casual sex that ironically bolstered heterosexual monogamy as the ultimate and ideal way to have a heterosexual relationship. The marital trajectory, as we've talked about so many times. Here are a few examples of some of the online sexual advice these researchers identified.
Casual sex is not for everyone. But if you've got the itch, especially bad at a certain point in time, and you feel it's necessary to scratch it, well then, you might want to heed my advice.
According to these advice columns and blogs, sex and emotions are inextricably intertwined in a way that casual sex required the right type of sexually sophisticated person who could detach sex and emotions.
Casual sex refers to engaging in the physical act of sex, plain and simple. As you refer to it, a bonking buddy. But that's it. No dates, no social outings, no meeting the family, no breakfasts out at cafes, no talk of the future. Basically, no relating outside a sexual realm.
And this from an online blog entitled How to Have a One-Night Stand.
Keep the emotional baggage light and the mood breezy. Don't talk about family, exes, therapy or love, and no candlelight.
Another rule prescribed in the online advice columns and blogs regarding emotional attachment was to not have casual sex with someone you love or like. Casual sex was not, I repeat, not, a route to a relationship, and individuals were advised it should never be undertaken with that intent. Engaging in casual sex with the goal of procuring a relationship was a way of doing casual sex wrong. In seeking casual sex, attraction was depicted in online sex advice columns and blogs as key when it came to partner selection.
Have sex with someone completely attracted to you, and vice versa. That's the whole point, really, isn't it? You want to feel good after it. And if you pick well, you'll be feeling sexier, happier, and more attractive for days.
In an article published in the journal Personality and Social Psychology, Terry D. Connolly, Department of Psychology and Women's Studies, University of Michigan, references a highly influential study by Russell D. Clark and Elaine Hatfield entitled Gender Differences in Receptivity to Sexual Offers. Clark and Hatfield demonstrated that whereas men were quite likely to accept a casual sexual offer from a Confederate research assistant, women never did. Conley assessed women's impressions of women and men who proposed a casual sexual encounter in the same way that Confederates in the Clark and Hatfield study did. Women and men agreed that female proposers of casual sex were more intelligent, successful, and sexually skilled than men who made the same proposal. Second, Conley demonstrated that the large gender differences from the original Clark and Hatfield study could be eliminated by asking participants to imagine proposals from attractive and unattractive famous individuals, friends, and same-gender individuals. It is interesting to note that in studies of this sort from the early 2010s, an example used as a male unattractive famous individual was often, quote, real estate investor Donald J. Trump. All right, we go on. The extent to which women and men believed that the proposer of casual sex would be sexually skilled was what predicted how likely they would be to engage in casual sex with this individual. In this episode, we will find that the topic of sexual skill will recur in a number of contexts. There is such a thing as sexual skill, and this is something that both women and men need and desire, whether in a one-night stand, a relationship, or a marriage. This is what men and women are looking for, someone with sexual skill. Big surprise? Which brings us to the topic of pleasure theory. The central thesis of pleasure theory is that the pursuit of pleasure is the central force that motivates sexual behavior. And just in passing, it was not until the idea was suggested to him by Sabina Spielrein that Sigmund Freud accepted that there is indeed a countervailing force to the pleasure principle, namely the Todestrieb, or death drive. According to pleasure theory, sexual reproduction is a byproduct of sexual pleasure rather than the reverse. Pleasure theory asserts that pleasure itself is evolutionarily favored, which is to say that if humans are having pleasurable encounters, enough instances of vaginal intercourse will occur to ensure the survival of the species. Pleasure theory does not directly speak to the gender differences between women and men in likelihood of responding favorably to a sexual proposal. However, one can extrapolate from pleasure theory's premise that pleasure is the central motivating factor in human sexuality. Because offers from women are accepted more often than offers from men, pleasure theory suggests that female proposers should be perceived differently than male proposers, particularly in expectations about the proposer's ability to provide sexual pleasure. In other words, expectations about his or her sexual capabilities. Thus, women should reject offers from men because they believe it is unlikely that men will provide them with sexual pleasure. Likewise, pleasure theory clearly indicates that the sexual capabilities of the proposal would be a strong predictor of sexual offer. Further, according to pleasure theory, gender differences in the Clark and Hatfield sexual proposal study can be explained by perceived differences in the amount of pleasure that women and men expect to receive from the sexual encounter. On the basis of pleasure theory, in this paper, Conley suggested that women actually see men as less likely to provide them with sexual pleasure and are therefore less likely to want to accept a casual sex offer from a man. In her study, large differences emerged in perceptions of male versus female proposers' sexual capabilities, with less pleasure anticipated from heterosexual male proposers, and perceived sexual capabilities was the only significant predictor besides gender of acceptance of a hypothetical sex offer, desire for a short-term relationship with a hypothetical proposer, and acceptance of actual casual sex proposals. Pleasure itself may be evolutionarily selected to the extent that if individuals are seeking sexual pleasure, enough procreative activities will occur to perpetuate the species. The current findings support a theory with evolutionary foundations, that is to say, pleasure theory, in showing the primacy of pleasure in sexual decision-making. And here, I cannot help but remind our regular listeners of something we reported in our last episode, namely that large penises are evolutionarily selected for because they produce the best orgasms in women, and because large penises are correlated with physical characteristics associated with the better survival of the species, namely height and health. So, women out there thinking of having a child, Darwin will thank you if you do it with a guy who is large where it counts. In an article entitled When Women Are Urged to Have Casual Sex More Than Men Are, published in the journal Sex Roles, Lori A. Rudman, Department of Psychology, Rutgers University, and her associates returned to the matter of sexual advice columns and blogs. They tell us that once the risks of casual sex encounters are eliminated, by which they mean primarily the risk of violence, but also sexually transmitted diseases and so forth, sexual double standards disappear, and people provide similar advice to women as well as men, encouraging them to have casual sex when costs are low, and discouraging them when costs are high. Returning to pleasure theory, physical pleasure sexually motivates both genders, but men are biologically more capable of experiencing orgasm with novel partners. This is primarily due to women requiring more friction, quote-unquote, to achieve orgasm. Over 70% of women do not experience orgasm through intercourse alone. Although women generally viewed casual sex as riskier than men did and advised greater caution to both male and female partners, both genders responded similarly to risk information, urging others to have sex when risk was low, discouraging sex when risk was high, regardless of the target gender. Their study uniquely demonstrates that men and women alike can be equally protective or enthusiastic in their sexual advice to others when provided with contextualized risk information. In another paper, the lead researcher of which was Terry D. Conley, this time joined by Ali Ziegler and Amy C. Mers, the researchers again found the perceived sexual ability of the casual sex proposer was the strongest predictor of accepting a casual sex offer for both women and men. More importantly, pleasure partially mediated the relationship between gender acceptance of a casual sex offer. Factors related to sexual strategies theory, for example, good earning prospects, status, and inclination to give gifts to partners, were not significant predictors of responses to a casual sex offer for women or men across a wide variety of contexts. To put it simply, When both genders are in the market for casual sex, what they are looking for is good sex. Good sex, full stop. They are not pursuing a sexual strategy to use sex to reach other goals. In the view of Explore Ecstatic Sensuality, this is a very good thing, although it leaves those with less, quote, perceived sexual ability, unquote, out in the cold. In the future, we will be awarding high sexual ability certificates to our listeners, together with Explore Ecstatic Sensuality lapel pins, rings, hats, and hoodies. You heard it here first. Leif Edvard Ottosson Kner, professor of personality psychology at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and his co-authors wrote a paper entitled, Why Do Women Regret Casual Sex More Than Men Do?, which was published in the journal Personality and Individual Differences. In their study, 547 participants in Norway and 218 participants in the United States reported their level of regret for their most recent casual sexual experience. Their results suggest that greater feelings of worry, experiencing disgust, and feeling pressured to have casual sex predicted more regret for casual sex. In contrast, experiencing higher levels of sexual gratification, finding the partner to be sexually competent, and being the one taking the initiative predicted less sexual regret. Having had casual sex with a sexually competent partner, that is to say, sexually skilled partner, reduced the likelihood of regretting the most recent casual sexual experience. The effect was stronger for women than for men. Americans were moderately less gratified by casual sex than were Norwegians. Anyone who is surprised by this finding, please raise their hands. In an article entitled Positive Feelings After Casual Sex by Jacqueline Wermer of Wayne State University and Antonia Abbey, published in the Journal of Sex Research, the authors reported on their study of 585 women and men who filled out a questionnaire in which they were asked to describe their most recent casual sex experience. For women and men, sexual assertiveness predicted sexual pleasure, and sexual pleasure was associated with positive affect. Men are, and this may come as a surprise to you, concerned that they may not be able to fulfill the sexual needs of the women with whom they have casual sex. In an article published in the Journal of Bisexuality, Heather L. Armstrong and Elke D. Rising of the School of Psychology, University of Ottawa, reported on a study of 73 women and 347 men. Male participants reported that they would feel moderate levels of pressure to show a bisexual female who had never had past sexual or romantic experience with a man that men can be more satisfying sexual or romantic partners compared to women. Men also reported moderate levels of worry that they would be unable to fulfill all of their partner's sexual needs. There were no differences based on relationship type, in other words, between a one-night stand and a relationship type that was longer-termed. In an article entitled, quote, Impact of Non-Heterosexual Impulses on Heterosexuals' Attitudes Toward Monogamy and Casual Sex, published in the journal Psychology and Sexuality, Joseph M. Curran of Texas Tech University and his associates discuss just that. According to these researchers, recent studies demonstrate 16% of men and 37% of women demonstrate some form of non-heterosexual attraction, behavior, or fantasy, although they endorse a heterosexual orientation status. In other words, they identify as heterosexuals. Their study explained the impact of attitudes toward monogamy and casual sex for individuals who endorse non-heterosexual impulses, but a heterosexual sexual orientation. A sample of 1,614 heterosexual men and women completed a voluntary questionnaire about sexual orientation, attraction, behaviors, and their attitudes toward casual sex and monogamy. Results revealed individuals who reported non-heterosexual sexual impulses endorsed increased acceptance of non-monogamous behavior and increased acceptance of casual sex. My question would be whether those who accept casual sex are the ones who are more likely to actualize, to play out their fantasies. Quite a few fantasies can be played out between a couple in an exclusive, monogamous relationship or marriage. But many more fantasies can be played out, actualized, through casual sex and through polyamorous, open relationships. Those intrigued by these thoughts may wish to listen to our previous episodes on fantasy and on polyamory. There is also the Big Five personality trait known as openness to new experience, which happens to be the personality trait or characteristic most commonly correlated with creativity. And perhaps openness to a variety of sexual experiences, activities, and partners is also correlated with creativity. The more you explore your sexuality, the more creative you can be. How by that? Do women really desire casual sex? An intriguing title for a scholarly article, that's for darn sure. Michelle Eskakadorn of the University of Colorado and William Jonkowski did in fact write such an article, which was published in the book Focality and Extension of Kinship, Essays in Memory of Harold W. Scheffler. These authors investigated posts in Adult Friend Finder, a hugely popular sex site which claims to have 20 million members. They found it revealing that of the females who expressed the strongest preference for partner variety, the majority of those females were bisexual. They did not anticipate that bisexual females would be the most prominent users of this dating site, namely Adult Friend Finders. It is significant that 54% of females who stated or strongly hinted at wanting no-strings-attached sex were bisexual/bi-curious. The women I used to know also used the term bi-furious. I need to check if that term has made it yet to the Urban Dictionary. Bi-furious babes, she called them. Typical of bisexual women on the Adult Friend Finder website was the following ad written by a 43-year-old bisexual woman who desired an emotional connection more than straightforward sexual satisfaction. She wrote that, quote, "Men capture my attention in an instant with their muscle, strength, cologne, deep voice, a 5 o'clock shadow, the feel, smell, and taste of them. How they are different from me." Then she added, "However, women too hold a fascination for me, softness, unexplored yet familiar territory, physical knowing, and the emotional connection. How they are similar to me," she concluded. The authors of this article call our attention to the fact that popular media has highlighted hooking up as constituting a new trend whereby females avidly seek out casual sexual trysts. 20 of the 60 heterosexual female profiles coded as seeking casual sex had profiles that explicitly stated the woman was coming out of a recent sexless marriage and desiring a woman that, in the words of a 38-year-old woman, would make her feel sexually desired again. This is consistent with some research that found women prefer sexual validation instead of momentary sexual pleasure. We have done an entire episode on the subject of attraction, which I highly recommend. Now, in terms of casual sex, what makes me want to have casual sex with one woman and not with another, the subject rears its ugly head, in this case beautiful head again. In an article by Susan Sprecher, published in the journal Semantic Scholar, she reports on an experimental study in which male and female university students were asked to indicate how attracted they were to an opposite-gender stimulus person after being presented information about the person's physical attractiveness, earning potential, and expressiveness. As hypothesized, subjects were more attracted to a physically attractive person than to a physically unattractive person, more attracted to a person with high earning potential than to a person with low earning potential, and more attracted to a highly expressive person than to a lowly expressive person. Of these three characteristics, physical attractiveness had the greatest effect on attraction. Contrary to sex role stereotypes, males and females were similarly affected by these partner characteristics. So, for a woman, the intriguing bulges in a man's biceps, or farther down, are more important than a similar bulge in his wallet. As the Beatles sang 3 lifetimes ago, money can't buy you love. In fact, in a study by Sherry Giacolino of San Jose State University, she found that women rated low socioeconomic status men as more attractive than high socioeconomic status men. Guys who listen to this podcast tell me things like, well, we're good friends. Hank says, Doris and I, we hang out, and I'm very helpful to Doris on things that she does, and she's very appreciative, and she signs things with the L word, things along those lines, and, well, I think we look good together, even though I don't look like much. But then, I don't know, I raised the topic of some kind of physicality or relationship between us, and it's a big no-no for her. And well, here we are again. There's no zaza-zoom. That's a word we used to use on episodes, and it comes back again. There's no zaza-zoom on her part. She's just not attracted to me, Hank says. This is a story that other guys relate to me too. It's not a particularly sad story. It's kind of a silly story. And because there's a friendship, because there's some kind of rapport, men develop expectations. Women sometimes, too, get in the same situation. Women develop exploitations, but I think the dynamic and the chemistry and that sort of thing is not the same. We'll talk about that some other time. But am I going to feel sad for Hank in his situation? Not particularly. I mean, she's told him, she's given him all the signs. He knows what's going on. If he, who's not a particularly attractive guy, I imagine, I saw his picture on Facebook, and well, it's not very good. He wouldn't exactly be the answer to a woman's prayers, as they used to say, in terms of appearance. But there's no chemistry there on her part. Attraction. We've talked about it. We did a whole episode on attraction. It is the view of this podcast that attraction is an essential component for any kind of thing at all, even in a certain way, and maybe in a big way, for casual sex, pickup sex, one-night stands, and sports sex. You don't want to have casual sex, pickup sex, one-night stand, that kind of thing, sports sex, with someone you're not attracted to at all, just like you don't want to have a relationship or a marriage or, heaven forbid, a family with someone you're not physically attracted to. That's the law, that's reality. Nothing's going to change that, baby. So we're going to do an episode at some point on how unattractive guys can pretend to be attracted to unattractive women and vice versa. It's kind of an acting exercise, and we'll have you practice in front of a mirror. We'll have you make videos of yourself. We'll show you photographs of unattractive women and have you pretend that you're attracted to them, just as an exercise. It will be interesting, and then you can try it in the real world, and you can see if it works. And if it gets you into a sexual situation without, and here's the key, without having to make any kind of commitment, without having it develop into a relationship. That's the deal. You must understand, though the touch of your hand makes my pulse react, that it's only the thrill of boy meeting girl. Opposites attract. It's physical, only logical. You must try to ignore that it means more than that. Oh, what's love got to do with it, got to do with it? What's love but a second-hand emotion? What's love got to do with it, got to do with it? Who needs a heart when a heart can be broken? Thank you, Tina Turner. Is it a surprise to you that women do not find your typical businessman type sexy? No, it's perhaps what our gay brothers would call, rough trade. Rough trade. Rough trade is often what women are looking for, and I don't put them down for that. How do women and men respond to or rate their casual sex experiences? Some research, and also certain moralistic societal pundits, tell us that women often have negative responses to their casual sex experiences, whereas men believe that casual sex for them is usually rad and groovy. Well, maybe, but this leaves out an important factor, a factor which some elements in our culture tell us to ignore. Pleasure. Let's turn now to a landmark study by Jennifer L. Piemonte of the Department of Psychology and Women's Studies, University of Michigan, and again Terry D. Conley and Stacy Grisakova. Results of their research indicate that orgasm mediates the gender differences in how positively participants respond to casual sex. Specifically, men are more likely to orgasm during casual sex, and people who orgasm during casual sex are more likely to experience positive reactions afterwards. Therefore, while gender may be one way to describe the discrepancy in how positively people feel following casual sex, orgasm explains it. Some research and also certain moralistic societal pundits tell us that women often have negative responses to their casual sex experiences, whereas men believe that casual sex for them is usually rad and groovy. Well, maybe, but this leaves out an important factor, a factor which some elements in our culture tell us to ignore. Pleasure. Let's turn to a landmark study by Jennifer L. Piemonte of the Department of Psychology and Women's Studies, University of Michigan, and again Terry D. Conley and Stacy Grisakova. Results of their research indicate that orgasm mediates the gender differences in how positively participants respond to casual sex. Specifically, men are more likely to orgasm during casual sex, and people who orgasm during casual sex are more likely to experience positive reactions afterwards. Therefore, while gender may be one way to describe the discrepancy in how positive people feel following casual sex, orgasm explains it. In actuality, casual sex reactions include a range of positive and negative experiences, but overall, young adults do not seem to be experiencing affective distress. Research finds that casual sex is associated with a variety of positive outcomes, such as reduced stress, improved mental health, and increased sexual subjectivity. A more immediate response following casual sex includes feeling more positive emotions than negative emotions. Previous research has located several factors associated with positive emotions, for example, in clinical symptoms, e.g. lower depression. Piemonte and her co-authors remind us that orgasm is both physiologically beneficial and psychologically enjoyable. A long history of medical and sexological research identifies the physiological benefits that occur during orgasm. We would add to that statement after orgasm. It is a key precept of this Explore Ecstatic Sensuality podcast that it is possible and highly desirable to lead an orgasmic life. A life at an ecstatic level of vibrancy, vigor, love, and creativity. And speaking of creativity, let us not forget that there can and should be a high level of creativity in one's sexual expression. Piemonte and her colleagues call our attention to research which demonstrates that increased variety in sexual behaviors during a given sexual scenario is positively associated with women's orgasms. In fact, the effect of varied sexual activities partially accounted for the difference in reported orgasm rates between women and men. Furthermore, women whose sexual scripts do not strictly adhere to the male orgasm and coital imperatives are more likely to report orgasming. Overall, given the prevalence of engaging in casual sex among young adults, this population would be well served by a broader range of sexual scripts on which they build their own sexual attitudes, behaviors, and feelings. And this goes even more for people who are older. I cannot speak for people over 40, but I hold a firm belief that sexual creativity will mean better sex and more orgasms for all age groups. In an article by researchers from the famous Kinsey Institute, published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior, the authors report that women who have sex with women are more likely to experience an orgasm during partnered sex compared to women who have sex with men. They investigated whether this difference can be partially accounted for by phallocentric imperative gendered sexual scripts that prioritize men's sexual experience over women's. For example, these imperatives emphasize vaginal penile intercourse, in other words, the coital imperative, and men's physical pleasure, in other words, the male orgasm imperative. They reasoned that a larger variety of sexual behaviors indicates less adherence to the coital imperative, and that more self-oriented orgasm goals for women indicate less adherence to the male orgasm imperative. In a sample of 1,988 women who have sex with men and 388 women who have sex with women, they found that women who have sex with women were 1.33 times more likely to experience an orgasm than women who have sex with men. This rate ratio was reduced to 1.16 after taking into account the variety of sexual behaviors and self-oriented orgasm goals. Women whose goals were oriented to their own orgasms. Their findings indicate that certain sexual scripts, e.g., phallocentric imperatives, help explain the orgasm discrepancy between women who have sex with women and women who have sex with men. Do you require any additional evidence that pleasure is important in casual sex? It is a truism to say, for men it's easy. But what exactly are people talking about when they say that? Is this a way of saying to ejaculate is easy? We have done an entire episode on male orgasm and plan to do others in the future. I would say here that ejaculation is not orgasm. But let us move our focus back to women who, we are told with some truths, have a hard time orgasming. In an article published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior by Justin R. Garcia and Elizabeth A. Lloyd of the Kinsey Institute and others, they report on a large sample, 52,588 to be precise, of U.S. adults who identified with various sexual orientations. Compared to women who orgasmed less frequently, women who orgasmed more frequently were more likely to receive more oral sex, have longer duration of last sex, be more satisfied with their relationship, ask what they want in bed, praise the partner for something they did in bed, call or email to tease about doing something sexual, wear sexy lingerie, try new sexual positions, have anal stimulation, act out fantasies, incorporate sexy talk, and express love during sex. Women were more likely to orgasm if their last sexual encounter included deep kissing, manual genital stimulation, and/or oral sex in addition to vaginal intercourse. Women who usually or always orgasm were especially more likely than women who never/rarely orgasm to say that they were involved in the following in their sex lives: wearing sexy lingerie, 21%, trying a new sexual position, 19%, talking or acting out fantasies, 16%, or trying anal stimulation, 14%. I could easily expand on this list, but we'll have to leave that for a future episode. In an article published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior, John Marshall Townsend of the Department of Anthropology, Syracuse University, and his co-authors introduce us to the concept of self-determination theory. They propose that people's motives for casual sex moderate associations between their sexual behavior and the outcomes they experience. They draw a distinction between autonomous motives for casual sex, for example, I wanted the fun and enjoyment, and non-autonomous motives, for example, I wanted to please someone else. They found that autonomous motives were more strongly associated with casual sexual behavior than were non-autonomous motives in both sexes. In other words, individuals of both genders are more likely to have casual sex for fun and enjoyment for themselves than to please another person. Some themes are beginning to emerge from this discussion. Have casual sex for your own fun, enjoyment, and pleasure. And let the person you are having casual sex with know what you want. Now, let's talk a little bit about hooking up, an activity which is a great deal more popular on contemporary college campuses than English 1A. In an article published in Sociology and Criminology, Allison Margaret Kelly Fouth of the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice, Virginia Wesleyan College, tells us that estimates of the percentage of those who have engaged in hooking up have ranged from as low as 40% to 75% to as high as 81%. 69% of their college and grad student samples defined hooking up as sex, whether vaginal, oral, and/or anal, and 23.5% defined hooking up as any intimate behavior ranging from kissing to sex. Perhaps this would be a good time to take a look at the history of casual sex. Barry Rie, Keith Sinclair Chair in History at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, whose most recent book, Sex Before Sexuality, A Pre-Modern History, has done exactly that. In his view, contemporary discussions of casual sex are curiously lacking in historical perspective. In his view, contemporary discussions of casual sex are curiously lacking in historical perspective. Professor Rie argues that studies which contrast the increased sexual possibilities of hookup sex to the assumed restrictive practices of an earlier era distort both the restrictions of the earlier period and the freedoms of the latter. He reminds us that Kinsey found that heterosexual working-class men were more likely to have had intercourse than to have indulged in kissing or petting. And we quote, "Many a college male will have kissed dozens of girls, although he has had intercourse with none of these. On the other hand, the lower-level male is likely to have had intercourse with hundreds of girls, but he may have kissed very few of them." How much of this is true, and how much of this is classism on the part of Kinsey? And is this still the case today? Perhaps, but in a different way. Now, let us again turn to a personality dimension often studied by researchers in casual sex, namely sociosexuality. In a paper entitled Sociosexuality and Bright and Dark Personality, the prediction of behavior, attitude, and desire to engage in casual sex, Elena Fernandez del Rio, Faculty of Social Sciences and Labor, University of Zaragoza, Spain, and her colleagues address this very topic. They suggest that research about sociosexuality understood as the differences in people's willingness to have casual sex without commitment in terms of its predictions, such as demographics, relationship status, or individual traits such as personality, is still scarce. Although sociosexuality was initially considered unidimensional, a tridimensional structure with behavior, attitudes, and desire as its components is gaining momentum in the literature. Previous research pointed out the positive associations between dark triad traits and unrestricted sociosexuality. The dark triad of personality traits consists of a set of 3 subclinical personality traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Narcissism is characterized by grandiosity, attention-seeking, profound lack of empathy, and a high sense of entitlement. Machiavellianism involves cold selfishness and pure instrumentality because manipulation and self-interest are its essential traits. Subclinical psychopathy is a personality trait characterized by impulsivity, antisociality, absence of remorse, and lack of ability to empathize or experience guilt. High scores on narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy appear to be more related to a less serious relationship, i.e., unrestricted sociosexuality or casual sex. With respect to dark personality, psychopathy was related to all 3 dimensions of sociosexuality, whereas all 4 aspects of the dark tetrad were associated with sociosexual desire. The dark tetrad, we remind you, is an expansion of the dark triad, which certain Canadians propose to include subclinical sadism. According to these psychologists' findings, only extroversion and psychopathy contributed positively to explain all the dimensions of sociosexuality. They found it interesting to note that psychopathy is the most relative predictor of all 3 dimensions of sociosexuality, namely behavior, attitudes, and desire. Consistent with previous research, high scores in psychopathy are associated with hypersexuality, high impulsivity, and a high need for stimulation, and this would influence desire, i.e., sexual arousal, due to the chance of casual sex, attitudes, and finally, unrestricted sociosexual behaviors. For example, having more sex partners, not being involved in a romantic relationship. The main characteristics of psychopaths, coldness, lack of empathy and remorse, need for continuous stimulation, inability to delay gratification, lack of long-term goals, impulsivity, and a lack of commitment, should facilitate the performance of a short-term mating strategy. Participants with high scores in neuroticism did not show a positive disposition toward uncommitted sex, nor were they comfortable engaging in sex without a sense of closeness or commitment. Moreover, neuroticism was not a significant predictor of sociosexual desire, which is the motivational disposition toward short-term relationship. So I guess it's time to ask yourselves if all of your pickups, hookups, booty calls, and associated other sex partners have been psychopaths. Are your fuck buddies psychopaths? Interesting question. On the other hand, perhaps going around actualizing your high need for stimulation and your high sexual desire is not such a bad thing. Maybe having what researchers called high sociosexuality is not such a bad thing. Society pressures us into the whole dating, marriage, home, and family ball of wax because those are consumer activities. It's capitalism, baby. I have talked in previous episodes about how men and women follow the script and end up living by rote without really relating as they proceed through all the steps, including retirement and death. Based on research on a college population, Jana van Grove, Department of Psychology, NYU, and Cornell, and Anthony D. Ong, Cornell, report that sociosexually unrestricted students typically reported higher well-being after having casual sex compared to not having casual sex. There was no such difference among sociosexually restricted individuals. Few gender differences were found. So if you have an open, healthy attitude toward casual sex, and if you then actually have casual sex, you'll feel great. But if you're uptight about sex, as they said in our grandparents' generation, you won't. As David Lynch would ask, can you believe it? Now it's time to actually have a one-night stand, but only if you're a beautiful woman and find me attractive. And what woman wouldn't? Professors and researchers from a bunch of German universities wrote an article entitled Engagement in One-Night Stands in Germany and Spain. Does Personality Matter?, which was published in the Journal of Personality and Individual Differences. Their research was based on a web-based study of 913 adults, 759 of whom were women, and it showed that extroversion and sensation-seeking are the strongest predictors of engagement in one-night stands. Extroversion, neuroticism, and sensation-seeking were predictors of the number of one-night stands, whereas the need of affect showed no incremental effect. Higher levels of these traits were accompanied by higher rates of one-night stands, although this set of predictors explained a relatively small amount of the variance. In other words, you can't go around and administer the standard psychological tests like the Big Five or the hexachord and say, she's likely to have a one-night stand and he isn't. But aren't we supposed to regret our one-night stands, since they are either events of cheating, and we did an entire episode on cheating here, or fun one-off events that distract us from the dating, marriage, family, retirement community deal? Svenning Sandberg and Sebastian Turnes of the Department of Sociology and Human Law, University of Oslo, Norway, wrote a marvelous article published in, of all places, the International Journal of Drug Policy. Their article is entitled The Pleasures of Drunken One-Night Stands, Assemblage Theory, and Narrative Environments, and it is from this article that I shall now quote. The data come from qualitative interviews conducted with 104 young participants in the nighttime economy. We show that 1. Alcohol-fueled sexual explorations, e.g. erotic fantasizing, flirting, and sex, are of paramount importance to young partygoers. 2. Sexualized territories, e.g. private parties, rural feasts, and the backseats of cars, significantly shape the experience and performance of one-night stands. And 3. Contrary to previous research, one-night stands are to a large degree associated with pleasure. The immediate pleasure of having sex and the long-term pleasure of talking about it to others. Conclusion, and here we're still quoting them, we argue that drunken one-night stands are part and parcel of a drinking culture that places high value on sexual encounters and personal sex stories. Gunnar, one of the subjects in this study, described what could be achieved in a one-night stand. It's not the sex itself, technically speaking. No, it is about meeting a new person. That chase and the affirmation. If you get to bring someone home, it's about being close to another person. It's also a good feeling physically the day after. The physical aspect of it. The pleasure of sex can extend well beyond the sexual interaction itself. It is something that is often anticipated with joy. It may be followed by a feeling of satisfaction, positive physical sensations, and the psychological benefits of having been sexually aroused and coming close to another human being. Moreover, many participants emphasized that casual sex could lead to positive feedback from peers in the form of recognition and respect. That is to say, in this sample, consensual casual sex was generally not associated with feelings of regret and shame in women, unquote. So you prudes out there, put that in your pipe and smoke it. In 1973, Canadian psychologist John Allen Lee introduced his color wheel theory of love. In his book, Colors of Love, an exploration of the ways of loving, Lee defined 3 primary, 3 secondary, and 3 tertiary love styles, describing them in terms of the traditional color wheel. The 3 primary types are Eros, Ludus, and Storge, and the 3 secondary types are Mania, Pragma, and Agape. We discussed this idea briefly in our interview with the brilliant psychotherapist and relationship counselor Anita DiFrancesco. In Personality, Attitudes, and Demographics as Predictors of One-Night Stands, an MA thesis presented at the California State University Fullerton by Tracy Tyson Smith, she tells us that the styles of love consist of Eros, which Leah described as a passionate physical and emotional feeling of wanting to satisfy, create sexual contentment, security, and aesthetic enjoyment for each other. For a person with an Eros love style, sex is the ultimate aesthetic experience. Agape, which is an altruistic love style. Mania, which Lee described as a mix between Ludus and Eros that is characterized by possessiveness and jealousy. Ludus, where love is a game in which the player desires to have as much fun as possible, even if that entails infidelity, concealment, or deception. Storge, which is a love based on companionship, or as Lee described it, love growing slowly out of friendship. And finally, Pragma, which Lee defines as the most practical form of love, not necessarily derived out of true romantic love. According to Tracy Tyson Smith, the Eros love style may be explained as a variable that looks at a one-night stand as a high-reward, low-investment situation. The Eros love style can be described as one in which sexual reward is favored over long-term companionship, and the investment for sexual rewards requires less from the individual than the investment for long-term companionship. So the individual with the Eros love style is more likely to engage in one-night stands than another love style. Individuals with the Storge love style, which is based on companionship, may be least likely to engage in one-night stands as it is a low or no commitment social exchange situation. Having a one-night stand was also associated with the Ludus, or game-playing love style. There will be a quiz at the end of this episode in which you will be asked to guess my love style. It should not be so hard. From what I hear tell, folks, as the politicians refer to people, go out looking for one-night stands, whereas for me, they happen naturally. I must be secretly Norwegian. And that's where we're going next. One place folks, go looking for one-night stands is something called Tinder. Trond Viggo of the Department of Psychology, Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Trondheim, Norway, and a group of co-authors with utterly unpronounceable names wrote an article entitled Hook, Line, and Sinker. Do Tinder matches and meetups lead to one-night stands? In this article, they report a detailed investigation of the efficiency of using Tinder to acquire one-night stands or meet potential long-term committed partners. Using self-reported data from 269 students, 62% women, they found that a very large number of matches are required for a relatively small number of meetups and result in a very limited number of hookups or potential romantic partner meetings. Merely 20% of the Tinder users in the sample have had one-night stands following Tinder use, and the majority of these only had one extra partner. The primary individual difference predictor of achieving casual sex using Tinder is unrestricted sociosexual attitudes, and this also predicts fewer potential romantic partner meetings. So those with unrestricted sociosexuality are not looking for romantic partners so much. Booty calls, on the other hand, are more my speed. We turn now to a paper entitled Positioning the Booty Call Relationship on the Spectrum of Relationships, Sexual but More Emotional Than One-Night Stands, by Peter K. Johannesson, Department of Psychology, University of West Florida, Norman P. Lee and Jessica Richardson, published in the Journal of Sex Research. Booty call relationships, these psychologists tell us, have the longevity to explore other aspects and interests of the individual's sexuality. Consistent with that, they found that booty call relationships were characterized by higher levels of kissing, in general, as well as manual and anal sex than in one-night stands. Individuals were more likely to leave after sex in the context of booty call relationships than in one-night stands. This may be because there is an implicit understanding between one-night stand partners that the nature of the relationship is casual and temporary, whereas the repeated encounters for booty call relationship partners requires a strategy to maintain the quasi-sexual nature of booty call relationships. However, booty call relationships are not simply one-night stands that repeat with the same person. They appear to be distinct. For instance, unlike one-night stands, booty call relationships are characterized by an equal amount of sexual and emotional acts. Participants who engaged in one-night stands reported more emotional and sexual acts. The authors did not predict this. However, on second thought, this does make sense. If one-night stands are characterized by a time constraint, few sexual acts can occur, and the emotional acts may be used in quick succession as means of escalating the relationship to sex. Well, sure, that's in line with my experience, and honestly, it is one of the great things about one-night stands. One-night stands consist of communication, caring, and personal exploration, rising in a crescendo to sex. Few experiences are this inspirational, since each one-night stand is unique. One-night stands teach us how much closeness is possible between a man and a woman, if only we just let it happen. An intriguing thing about one-night stands is something that ties into evolutionary themes we've talked about in this episode and in the last one. Julia Robertson and Trevor Hussey of Buckinghamshire New University presented a most enlightening paper at the Human Behavior and Evolution Studies Annual Conference in Montpellier, France. In their study, partial correlation was used to explore the relationship between male height and likelihood of having sexual intercourse on one and only one occasion. There was a highly significant negative correlation with greater height being associated with fewer one-time partners. We instantly remember that greater height is associated with longer penises and longer penises with deep vaginal orgasms in women, so women are more likely to grab up such men for a longer-term relationship and leave the shorties, in terms of both height and penis size, for one-night stands. After the brief test drive, there is no need to consider a booty call or friends with benefits relationship, let alone anything more set and established with a guy whose nickname might be Pee-wee. There is, and wouldn't you know it, an academic journal entitled Social Problems. And lo and behold, for some university types, casual sex is one such social problem. In an article contained in said publication, Lisa Wade, Department of Psychology, Occidental College, tells us that sex on college campuses has emerged as a source of emotional distress for students. This paper adopts a sexual feels approach to offer a gendered analysis of hookup culture's central emotional imperative to be casual about sex. Based on 101 first-person accounts of sex and relationships in college, the findings reveal how students enact sexual casualness by hooking up only when drunk, refraining from tenderness, being unfriendly afterwards, and avoiding repeat hookups. Students both break and follow these rules. Breaking them is a primary way they form romantic relationships, but also a source of stigma, especially for women. This process helps explain some of the negative emotional consequences of hookup culture, as well as how hookup culture suppresses relationship formation and also friends with benefits arrangements. So, what about the research that tells us that people engage in casual sex for fun and enjoyment without pressure to quickly form a relationship and get on what I have called in previous episodes the marital trajectory? Sharon Pfeiffer, author of the She Knows column in the popular publication Business Insider, wrote a piece entitled, Why It's More Important to Have Casual Sex Than You Think. One of the key points she makes in that article is, society has conditioned us to believe that sex has to have an emotional meaning to be good, but it's perfectly okay to want to explore a more casual situation. Gigi Engel, a sex educator and writer of the best-selling book All the Fucking Mistakes, also doesn't think casual sex deserves its bad rap. To quote her, every negative side effects of casual sex has deep puritanical roots born from slut-shaming. If we had comprehensive, pleasure-based sex education in this country, people would have the resources they need to make empowered choices. We demonize casual sex because we demonize having sex outside of marriage. Of course it has a bad rap with these notions shrouding it. We live in a society that has conditioned us to think sex has to have emotional meaning to be good, says Engel. When you've been told that having casual sex makes you a slut, or if he or she doesn't call you afterwards, you're worthless, well, this can sting. In reality, hookups are fun, says Engel. When done safely, they rock. Having sex in a way that makes you feel good about yourself is the most important thing. You can discover a lot about yourself, what you like, what you don't like, what works for you, says Engel. It's a great way to meet interesting people and to explore different sexual tastes you might not explore otherwise. Sabah Haruni Luri, a licensed marriage and family therapist, reminds clients there are times when a handshake is just a handshake, and there are times when just touching someone's hand can be electrifying and emotionally gratifying. The same is true of sex, she says. It's perfectly okay to want to explore casual sex. There are plenty of benefits for those who care to partake. Some of you folks out there, whoops, I'm sounding like Barack Obama again, may have already spent time on hookup apps such as Casual with a K. We have too, and we were most intrigued by what they have to tell their visitors. And we quote, according to a recent survey, 72% of test subjects have had at least one positive experience with casual sex. That means that you'll score at least 1 out of 10 times you try. With such high odds working in your favor, the chances are that your casual escapades will eventually turn out to be quite positive experiences. People who often had casual sex with random strangers report higher thriving, lower stress, and well-improved being. In fact, the more you have casual sex, the less you feel its negative consequences as they give way to the positive aspects. 1. Casual sex helps you cope with regret. The more active and positive you are toward casual sex, the less regret you'll be dealing with. 2. Casual sex makes you feel good. Engaging in sex without emotional intimacy, commitment, or love can give you a serious self-esteem boost and do wonders for your mental health. Aside from all the health benefits of having sex regularly, casual sex helps socio-sexually unrestricted persons to gain satisfaction and self-esteem. 3. Casual sex leads to incredible orgasms. The research showed that casual sex could lead to achieving incredible orgasms for both women and men. You must understand that hooking up isn't your average date where things may or may not go as planned. Hooking up can lead to the most incredible orgasms of your life. We can tell you one thing for sure. Don't let the studies do your thinking for you. Simply do as you please and allow yourself to truly enjoy it. 4. No playing games. Once you get into the casual mode, there's no need to worry about whether you should call your partner or not, or about coming across as too kind or too keen. Hooking up allows you to relax and work on what you want and need. This isn't us saying that you should not be concerned about your casual partner and their feelings. It's a straightforward deal. You're just two people having sex. Nothing more, nothing less. There's no need to feel like you should do anything more. And finally, 5. No responsibilities or commitment. Hooking up is so great because there's no commitment or any other kind of responsibilities, just you and your primal instinct, the desire and the need. You don't have to call your partner ever again if you don't feel like it. You don't have to deal with any pressure of meeting their partners, friends, parents, and so on either. In fact, you don't have to do anything you don't feel comfortable with. Unquote. Well, heck, I could have written that, but I didn't. Need to find a way to monetize my wisdom more. Now, it's time to ask why people enjoy their hookups, and women in particular, since some writers insist that they don't. Melissa A. Lewis, Department of Psychology and Behavioral Sciences, University of Washington, and her associates, wrote an article entitled Predictors of Hookup Sexual Behaviors and Emotional Reactions Among U.S. College Students, which was published in the journal Archives of Sexual Behavior. Hooking up, they tell us, can be defined as a sexual encounter where two people are physically intimate, kissing, touching, oral sex, vaginal sex, anal sex, with someone whom they are not dating or in a romantic relationship with at the time, and in which it is understood there is no mutual expectation of a romantic commitment. Research conducted by Robin L. Fiedler and Michael P. Carey, Center for Health and Behavior, Syracuse University, found that women who had penetrative sexual hookups reported greater distress and lower self-esteem. However, distress and self-esteem were assessed more generally than as a direct result of hooking up. To put this another way, if a woman is distressed and has low self-esteem in general, and she has penetrative hookup sex, she is likely to be the same afterwards, that is, to be distressed and have low self-esteem. Penetrative sex won't solve her problems or resolve her issues. Fielder and Carey found that college women reported enjoying their most recent hookups and indicated a low level of regret. Findings indicate that having oral sex during the most recent hookup was associated with greater positive affect and was not a predictor of negative affect. I have described in this episode a plethora of reasons to enjoy, to exult in, to glory in, to share with your partner in, with your lover, even lover of the moment, in casual sex. Booty calls, pickup sex, one-night stands, fuck buddy sex, yeah. All of this having been said, I need to spend just a couple of minutes telling you, in my opinion, one very good reason not to have casual sex, and perhaps not to have sex at all, and not to have a relationship at all. Are you ready? And what if you're a little bit older and single? This is a really big problem because you get these people who are desperately, quote-unquote, lonely, or they feel in a certain way that they don't want to end up alone. I better get someone right now, or I'm going to end up all by myself, or, golly, I'm going to end up having to pay the rent and household expenses all by myself, or all by myself I can't afford a vacation, or all by myself I can't afford to buy a house, all by myself I have to do everything myself. I have to do all the housework and all the blah, 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 and I can never have kids if I'm single and alone, all that kind of stuff. So you get into people in that pattern. So you get people who are older, people in their 30s or 40s, or those really old folks, people who are older than that, who are desperate. They hate the idea of being all by themselves. And in a certain way, they lose the knack. They lose the knack. This obsession with being alone takes away any nuance that they have to their sexual experience, because if they get someone into bed or into a necking kind of situation, that kind of silly kind of thing, it's all about their loneliness. If you're with someone and you're having a sensuous encounter, you're having a encounter that is sexy, you're having an experience, a physical experience, an emotional experience that is sexy, the last thing that should be about is your bleeping loneliness. No, really? Is he going to say how lonely he is and how really, really nice it is that he's here with me? Oh boy, the warning alarms, the warning signals, if I were a woman, would really go off right away. It's another one of these lonely, desperate guys. Yeah, it's not so good. And women play the same melody, that same obsessive melody of, I'm so lonely, please hold me. I'm so lonely, please hold me. It's been so long since I've had anyone hold me, and all this kind of stuff. Again, the warning bells go off for a lot of guys who hear that. There's no play about it. There's no fun about it. There's little sensuality about it. It's all about this obsessive thing about being alone. Desperation. If I end up alone, I feel that I will have lost the game, that I am a loser, that I am a failure. If I end up alone, my self-esteem will be crap. Well, yeah, people really feel like this. There are people I know, particularly people who are old, really old, like, over 60. They're around there, you can't avoid them, who say exactly that. If I end up alone, I feel that I will have lost the game. Not a good thing from the standpoint of this particular podcast. Not a good thing at all. What really is good is to have that kind of loving casual sex, those loving pickups, that loving sports sex, even those loving one-night stands or shorter-term being together, which is not defined by either party as proto-marital, premarital, relationship-headed, unless something happens that triggers that on the part of both parties that is not about one of those factors of loneliness or anything like that per se. Oh, I'll be so miserable if I'm not here with you because no one else is going to want me. Oh, please stay with me, and all of that poppycock, all of that flapdoodle. No, thank you. In our next section, we are going to pretend that we are entering college again as freshmen. And needless to say, the first thing that enters our minds is going to be hookup sex. Again, English 1A just ain't that exciting. In a study published in the journal Archives of Sexual Behavior, Robin L. Fielder, again, Jennifer L. Walsh, Brown University, and their co-researchers sought to identify predictors of sexual hookup behavior among first-year college women using a prospective longitudinal design. Casual sex is often defined as meeting a partner and having sexual intercourse that same day, having sexual intercourse with a partner once and only once, or having sexual intercourse without emotional commitment. In contrast, the term hookup is used to refer to a variety of sexual behaviors, i.e., broader than just vaginal sex, and hookup partners usually know each other. For example, they are friends or friends of friends, and may hook up on multiple occasions. A second difference is the high prevalence, i.e., 70% to 80% of this population, of hookup behavior, and the fact that hooking up is done openly and appears to be a normative experience for young people attending college today. A third difference is the accompanying desire to delay or avoid romantic relationships among emerging adults in favor on self-development during the college years. Thus, although hooking up and casual sex both entail a lack of commitment, they appear to be distinct. Casual sex can be considered a form of hooking up, but in a certain way, not vice versa. These researchers studied 483 participants, 67% of whom were white. Over the course of the school year, 20% of women engaged in at least one hookup involving receiving oral sex, 25% in at least one hookup involving performing oral sex, and 25% engaged in at least one hookup involving vaginal sex. So-called risk factors for sexual hookups included hookup intentions, impulsivity, sensation-seeking, pre-college hookups, alcohol use, marijuana use, social comparison orientation, and situational triggers for hookups. Risk factors, these are labeled as. So-called protective factors, on the other hand, against sexual hookups included subjective religiosity, self-esteem, religious service attendance, and having married parents. Race/ethnicity, socioeconomic status, hookup attitudes, depression, cigarette smoking, academic achievement, injunctive norms, parental connectedness, and being in a romantic relationship were not consistent predictors of sexual hookups. In the personality system, women who were higher in impulsivity engaged in more hookups involving receiving oral sex. Maybe this is because they were impulsive enough to explain to the guys they were with that this is what they wanted, and perhaps also how they wanted it. Additionally, contrary to these researchers' hypothesis, women with higher levels of depression engaged in fewer hookups involving receiving oral sex. Well, perhaps if they received more oral sex during their hookups, they would be less depressed. In our experience, women who are given great head tend not to be very depressed, especially afterward. Self-esteem was not related to receiving oral sex or having vaginal sex during hookups, but among women who performed oral sex during hookups, higher self-esteem predicted a lower number of hookups. In contrast to these researchers' expectations, being in a committed relationship at baseline was not protective against oral or vaginal sex hookups. However, among women who engaged in hookups involving receiving oral sex, those who were in a relationship at baseline reported a higher number of hookups. The obvious reason for this being that their boyfriends weren't giving it to them. Like, duh. This is one of the main reasons that people cheat, to get something they want and need that their relationship partners are not giving them or refuse to give them. Let us continue with our theme of oral sex a little bit longer. In a paper by Laura Backstrom, Department of Sociology, Indiana University, Elizabeth A. Armstrong, Department of Sociology, University of Michigan, and Jennifer Puentes, published in the Journal of Sex Research. The authors inform us that according to the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior, a probability survey of American sexual behavior released in October 2010, 59% of 18 to 19-year-old men had received oral sex from a woman, and 61% had given oral sex to a woman. The NSSHB also reported that 62% of 18 to 19-year-old women had received oral sex from a man, and 61% had performed oral sex on a man. This behavior reflects a sharp rise from mid-20th century findings as reported by Kinsey and Associates that 17% of female adolescents had performed fellatio and 11% of males had performed cunnilingus. In the book Social Organization of Sexuality, Sexual Practices in the United States, Edward O. Lauman, John H. Gagnon, and others described the incidence and frequency of fellatio and cunnilingus as, quote, the most basic change in the script for sex between men and women to take place over the course of the 20th century. These women did not differentiate between the inclusion of fellatio and cunnilingus during a sexual encounter and viewed the performance of these acts as an equal exchange. If they gave their partner oral sex, they expected to receive oral sex from their partner in both hookups and in relationships. Approximately 30% of the women reported engaging in reciprocal oral sex during a hookup. In most of these cases, the male partners initiated cunnilingus without much prompting by the women. Only a few were outspoken and motivated enough to demand it from the hookup partners. One participant in the study felt that it was important to communicate her desires regardless of relationship context.
In any general hookup, I'm very vocal about what I want, because it's like a roadmap. Unless they know where they're going and what they need, and how to get there, then they're not going to reach their destination. That's my theory. So I'm pretty vocal, and I will, if I'm about to go down on a guy, I'll say, by the way, if this isn't going to get reciprocated, then just leave. But some men just don't eat parsley.
In an article entitled The Scripting of Oral Genital Sexual Conduct, John H. Gagnon, again Distinguished Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and William Simon, Kinsey Institute of Sex Research, advises to keep in mind the multiple meanings of oral sex which are less well measured or often may only be inferred on the basis of inadequate evidence. At different times in the same relationship or in differing relationships, the same physical movements may be performed as an avoidance of coitus, an expression of intimacy, a sign of erotic competence, or a measure of degradation of the self or the partner. Thus spake these individuals. In an M.A. thesis by Laura Melissa Walkington at the University of California, Riverside, the author tells us that existing sociological research on oral sex and heterosexual hookups focuses on college women and adolescents and does not explicitly interrogate the association of oral sex with power. Drawing on a sample of 386 women's advertisements for casual hookups on Craigslist, Walkington's study finds language that clearly associates oral sex with power. Fellatio is mentioned more often than cunnilingus and is linked in the ads to women's sexual submission and dominance. Both. Cunnilingus, on the other hand, is linked only with women's dominance. These findings support previous research that casual hookup sex tends to emphasize men's domination as well as sexual pleasure. 9 out of 89 fellatio-only ads include language indicating women ad writers in her sample associate fellatio with women's sexual submission. Of the ads sampled, female dominance was most strongly associated with cunnilingus only, occurring in 11 out of 37 cunnilingus-only ads, 2 out of 11 fellatio-only ads, and in 6 of 7 ads referring both cunnilingus and fellatio where power language is present. With each of the 11 ads referencing cunnilingus and not fellatio, including language associated cunnilingus with women's sexual dominance, she found clear evidence that the women ad writers in her sample associate cunnilingus with women's sexual dominance. This is intriguing, but gives us reason to pause. There is an assumption in the Craigslist universe that men are only interested in giving women pleasure while they are being dominated. What do our listeners think? One conclusion that this author derives from her Craigslist research is that both women and men assume fellatio will occur in casual sex hookups, whereas cunnilingus had to be requested and negotiated within casual hookups. Assumptions. In a chapter of the book entitled The Psychology of Love and Hate in Intimate Relationships, Peter K. Jonassen, Department of Psychology and Social Sciences, Western Sydney University, and Rhonda L. Barzini, University of Western Ontario, explain how booty call relationships differ from other types of casual sex and what their advantages are. According to them, a booty call relationship is one where a person has repeated sexual encounters with someone, but intentionally restricts their interactions to the sexual in order to ensure that it does not escalate to a more serious relationship. Booty call relationships do not fit well into the apparent dichotomy of one-night stands and serious romantic relationships because they combine elements of both long-term relationships and short-term relationships. For women, they offer some stability and also access to men they might not otherwise have access to, whereas men may benefit from relatively easy access to sex. Helen Fisher, biological anthropologist and senior research fellow at the Kinsey Institute, and one of the world's leading sex researchers and theorists, wrote an article with the intriguing title, "Casual Sex May Be Improving America's Marriages." She is also senior scientific advisor to the site Match.com. She reports as follows, and we quote, "For the past 5 years, my colleagues at Match.com and I have conducted an annual national survey called Singles in America. And in each year, a majority of survey respondents have reported having a one-night stand. And 27% of our respondents reported having had a one-night stand turn into a long-term committed relationship. Who knew? In 2013, 58% of men and 50% of women in our Singles of America study reported that they'd had a friends with benefits relationship, including 1 in 3 people in their 70s. The basic circuits for romantic love lie in primitive regions of the brain, near those that orchestrate thirst and hunger. Romantic love is a drive, one of 3 basic brain systems that evolved to direct our fundamental human mating and breeding strategy. The sex drive predisposes you to seek a range of mating partners. Romantic love enables you to focus your mating energy on a single individual at a time, and feelings of attachment incline you to form a pair bond, at least through the infancy of a single child. Feelings of romantic love and deep attachment to a partner emerge in a pattern highly compatible with the spirit of the times. That is, with slow love. Slow love. We've even begun to map some of the brain circuitry responsible for marital happiness. In our study of long-term lovers, those who scored higher on a marital satisfaction questionnaire showed more activity in a brain region linked with empathy, a trait they had most likely retained from their initial passion. However, when psychologist Mona Hu and her colleagues used that is to say Helen Fisher's, original research design to collect similar brain data on 18 young men and women in China, she found that those who were in love long-term showed activity in a brain region associated with the ability to suspend negative judgment and over-evaluate a partner, what psychologists call positive illusions. The idea that long-term love is a matter of suspending negative judgment strikes me as truly strange. If your husband or wife or relationship partner is doing something that really bugs you, and worse, that you know it is harmful either to him or to you, you have a right to say something. Smoking is a good example. Not that you should harass your partner about it, but it can and perhaps should be a make or break issue in a relationship. Before we, in the great tradition of Snoop Dogg, wrap up this episode, let's let Chuck Darwin and his adherents have their say once again. Why the bleep do we have sexual reproduction anyway? Starfish, aphids, and desert grassland whiptail lizards get along perfectly well without it. Have you heard any of the members of these species complaining recently? In an article entitled, quote, "Sexual Hookup Culture, a Review" by Justin R. Garcia of the Kinsey Institute again, with Chris Reber, Sean G. Massey, And Anne M. Merriweather of Binghamton University, published in the journal Review of General Psychology, the authors ask us to consider the following. Compared to asexual reproduction, sexual reproduction is quite costly. Sexually reproducing organisms pay many costs, including the time, energy, and resources spent in finding and attracting mates, tasks that are unnecessary for asexual reproducers. Well, if you are as attractive as I am, attracting women takes like zero effort. Offsetting the costs of sexual reproduction in large-bodied organisms is the benefit sexual reproduction provides against easy colonization by parasites and pathogens. Sexual reproduction scrambles up genes, creating genotypes that are novel environments and forcing the parasites and pathogens to begin anew in their quest to exploit the host. Thus, large-bodied organisms with long lifespans generally benefit evolutionarily from sexual reproduction despite its substantial costs. Women are expected to prefer long-term relationship to extract a maximum amount of resources from their mates. Get that? Women will engage in short-term sex when it is typically viewed as an infidelity to obtain better quality genes for offspring. That is, sexual strategies theory, a mid-level theory within the larger evolutionarily meta-theoretical framework, does allow for both men and women to engage in long-term and short-term sexual behaviors, but for sex-specific evolutionary reasons. Researchers Peterson and Hyde in 2010 conducted a thorough meta-analytic review of gender differences in sexuality, 834 individual studies, and 7 national data sets across 87 countries. Men and women are more similar than different in a majority of sexual behaviors. In a cross-cultural study of 16,288 individuals across 52 nations, of those who are single, 79.3% of men and 64.0% of women reported seeking a short-term mate in some way. Thus, nearly two-thirds of unpartnered women are interested in uncommitted sex, and over one-fifth of unpartnered men are not interested in this activity. Using biological and cross-cultural evidence, Helen Fisher, again of the Kinsey Institute, to whom we've referred several times earlier in this episode, in her book, Anatomy of Love, The Natural History of Monogamy, Adultery, and Divorce, has argued that humans possess a dual reproductive strategy of social monogamy, serial or long-term, and clandestine adultery. In her book chapter entitled Serial Monogamy and Clandestine Adultery, Evolution and Consequences, the Dual Human Reproductive Strategy, Dr. Fisher tells us the following. Researchers indicate that some 30% to 50% of American married men and women are adulterous. Currently, 70% of American dating couples report an incidence of infidelity in their relationship. Data collected in the 1980s indicated that 72% of men and 54% of women were unfaithful at some point during their marriage. Furthermore, and here's where it gets kinky a little bit, in a recent study of single American men and women, 60% of men and 53% of women admitted to mate poaching, trying to woo an individual away from a committed relationship to another to begin a relationship with them instead. Mate poaching is also common in 53 other cultures. In our next episode, I'm going to offer a recipe for poached mates on toast. Stay tuned. But back to Dr. Fisher. In fact, she tells us, infidelity is so widespread and persistent in monogamous avian and mammalian species, including humans, that scientists now refer to monogamous species as practicing social monogamy in which partners display the array of social and reproductive behaviors associated with monogamy while not necessarily displaying sexual fidelity as well. She goes on to tell us that another biological system may contribute to infidelity. And here, my dear listener, we get even kinkier. Watch out. In the now classic sweaty t-shirt experiment, women sniffed the t-shirts of several anonymous men and selected the t-shirts of those they felt were sexiest. They selected t-shirts of men with different genes, that is to say from themselves, in a specific part of the immune system, the major histocompatibility complex, MHC. In a subsequent investigation, women married to men with similar genes in this part of the immune system were also more adulterous, and the more of these genes a woman shared with her spouse, the more extradyadic partners she engaged sexually. In our Explore Ecstatic Sensuality sex shops, ask your investment advisor about our upcoming IPO, we are going to be selling Explore Ecstatic Sensuality t-shirts. Watch out. But to give Dr. Fisher the floor one last time. Most curious, she writes, regardless of the many correlations between relationship dissatisfaction and adultery, in an article by Shirley P. Glass and Thomas L. Wright, published in Sex Roles, a journal of research, those authors report that among Americans who engage in infidelity, 56% of men and 34% of women rate their marriage as happy or very happy. Again, we refer you to our earlier episode devoted entirely to the subject of cheating. Let us conclude with an observation by Ross Ballister of Oxford University, Sandra Hebron of the British Independent Film Awards, Elizabeth Fraser, and Margaret Beetham, who is still dispensing pearls of wisdom at the age of 103. The construction and maintenance of any social order entails the construction and maintenance of certain pleasures that can secure consent and participation in that order. That any cultural form is pleasurable and ideological is, then, neither surprising nor worrying. What else could pleasure be, and how else could ideology work?
I've had an out-of-body experience, but it was nowhere near as painful as an out-of-booty experience. When good booty goes bad.
I would like to take a moment to say something about the person who inspired this podcast and to highly recommend the books she's written and also her professional services. Her name is Anita DiFrancesco. She is a psychotherapist. She is a very experienced and professional relationship counselor. She has 2 wonderful podcasts, It's Your Voice! And that continues on with a new podcast called Discover Joyous Love, on which I've also been a guest. It was a wonderful experience, as it always is, communicating with Anita. So check out her podcast. Her books are extraordinary. One is called Live Free, Recreate and Liberate Your Life, the best book title I could possibly think of, a classic title for a book, in which she really takes you through things you can do to make major changes in elevating your self-love, self-esteem, happiness, and even to help you sexually to find a greater sexual fulfillment and vitality. And her other book, different but also relevant, is a true crime thriller, the Donna Gentili story, which concerns the brutal murder of her first cousin, Donna Gentili, and her, that is Anita's, personal efforts to identify the killer. 2 great books available on Amazon, or check out Anita's own website, tantrawisdom.com. You can find her there, and also on her Facebook pages, which are Love and Relationship Coach, and also her business page, Tantra Wisdom. Thanks for checking her out. You won't be disappointed. Oh, this one is so hysterical.
Yeah, this is pretty silly.
Maybe Anita has it. Okay,
Right.
Stop.
30 thrusts in each position by mandate as a motto over the bed. I wonder how they count these.
I think that would be a great song. 30 thrusts in each position.
That could be a long night if there's 600 positions. This is advice from the heart.